The snow had been falling for hours in Coldwater, Minnesota, coating the streets in a hush that made the world seem gentler than it was. It was past midnight, and the emergency room at Coldwater Regional Medical Center was unusually still. Machines hummed their mechanical lullabies, and the soft flicker of fluorescent lights gave the place a sterile serenity. But that serenity fractured the moment the double doors swung open. At 2:46 a.m., the silence was broken not by sirens or cries, but by the low squeak of gurney wheels. A child no more than 9 was wheeled in frail, motionless with dark hair clinging to her damp forehead and a belly grotesquely rounded beneath her hospital gown. She stared upward, not blinking, not present as though she had left her body hours before. Dr. Michael Ellison, a man weathered by 25 years in trauma care, rose from behind his desk with the slow tension of a man bracing for something unnameable. His coffee had gone cold, his notes forgotten. What he saw on that gurney rooted him. She looked like she should be holding a stuffed animal not bearing the weight of pregnancy. And yet, here she was. Emily Grace Dalton, the nurse said. 9 years old, 7 months pregnant. Pain began earlier in the evening. The local clinic couldn't handle it. Transferred here with her grandmother, Margaret Dalton, who stood silently nearby, gripping her own elbows like a woman trying to keep her bones from breaking. Dr. Ellison's gloved hands moved with practiced precision, but inside he felt the ground tilt. Emily made no sound, no flinch, not even a glance. Her chest rose in a mechanical rhythm, a child breathing, yet somehow lifeless. He'd seen overdoses, car wrecks, even gunshots to the chest, but this was different. There were no visible injuries, no bruises, no blood. Only silence wrapped in the pale hospital sheets and stretched tightly across her belly. He felt not for the first time that medicine was inadequate. There were no prescriptions for what silence like this could mean. Margaret's voice when it came was brittle. She hasn't spoken. Not for a while now. She didn't elaborate. Grief often wore masks, guilt, confusion, denial. Dr. Ellison didn't press. There would be time, or maybe there wouldn't. Either way, silence had to be respected before it could be broken. In the dimmed examination room under the cold fluorescence, he took a small spiral notebook from the supply drawer and a pencil from his coat pocket. Without a word, he placed them beside the girl's still hand. "Sometimes it's easier to draw than to speak," he said gently as though addressing a deer too frightened to run. Emily didn't react. He stepped away, returning to her vitals. All normal. All stable. All wrong. Nothing about this was normal. Nothing about a child carrying a child ever would be. The scan confirmed what he already suspected. A viable fetus approximately 30 weeks. No signs of recent trauma. No STDs, no infection, no immediate threat to her or the fetus. She was medically safe, but emotionally she had fallen somewhere unreachable. And yet something small happened. A sound so slight it could have been imagined the scratch of pencil against paper. He turned. Emily was drawing. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like someone remembering how to move underwater. She didn't look at the page. She didn't look at him. She just drew. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he watched. The drawing unfolded in silence. A house square, simplistic, but wrong. No windows, no chimney, no sky. The door was exaggerated with a dark, uneven rectangle in the center, an oversized padlock. To the right of the house, a tall figure loomed, lacking a face or limbs, just a shapeless shadow towering over the building. In the far bottom corner, smaller than the rest, was a child. Her mouth missing, her body curved inward like a comma, alone. It wasn't just a picture. It was testimony. And this hospital room with its cold instruments and tired staff had just become a courtroom of the unspeakable. Dr. Ellison placed the sketch into a clear sleeve. Not for evidence. Not yet. For protection. Drawings like this weren't imagination. They were memory distorted not to deceive but to survive. In trauma training, they taught about nonverbal cues, symbolic expression, developmental psychology. But nothing prepared you for the moment when a child screamed through silence. He wrote in her chart, "Subject displays signs of acute trauma." Expression through symbolic imagery. Initial drawing suggests emotional isolation, perceived entrapment, and an external persistent threat. He paused. No human figures present within the home. Implication home is not a place of safety. The words felt too clinical, too detached, but detachment was part of the job, until it wasn't. Margaret sat in the waiting area, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't asked any questions. She hadn't made any demands. That scared him more than yelling would have. Dr. Ellison approached slow, deliberate. "She's stable," he said. Margaret nodded barely. "She hasn't said a word since it all started," she whispered. "I thought she was just shy. Quiet. She was always so quiet." Dr. Ellison didn't respond. He didn't need to. Sometimes silence wasn't a lack of words, it was a space where pain had no name yet. As he returned to the hallway, he glanced through the glass. Emily lay in bed, eyes open, staring not at the ceiling but past it into something only she could see. The pencil rested on her chest like a relic. Her breathing was slow, even, too calm, like someone who had already survived the worst and wasn't sure how to feel afterward. There would be reports. There would be investigations. There would be names whispered behind closed doors. But not yet. Now, there was only a child in a hospital bed and a doctor who didn't know how to reach her but would not stop trying. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, a door had just been drawn with a lock, and somewhere behind that lock a child waited. Morning in Coldwater was not defined by warmth or sunlight, but by the faint hum of radiators and the distant scrape of snowplows against pavement. The hospital stirred slowly, staff moving in hushed tones. Coffee warming, chilled hands, and chart updates blinking quietly on monitors. But room 204 remained unnaturally still. Emily Grace Dalton lay in the same position, her small body swallowed in white sheets, her eyes half-lidded, staring not at the wall but through it as if searching for a way out of a room no door could offer. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't cried. She hadn't asked a single question, and Dr. Michael Ellison had not pressed her. Instead, he sat by the door, reading quietly, breathing the same air, existing in proximity, not authority. It was a delicate science presence. To sit near a wounded soul without asking it to perform healing. He had learned that in the wake of his own daughter's illness, how sometimes the most sacred thing you could give was space. On the small side table, the notebook remained, unmoved since the night before. But that morning, as the light filtered in through half-closed blinds, something shifted. Emily's fingers. Those same fingers that had been limp, uncertain, moved. Not deliberately, not with urgency, but with memory. She reached out, lifted the pencil, and began to draw again. Dr. Ellison did not stand, did not lean forward. He simply watched and listened. The lines were less confident than before, lighter, as if unsure they deserved permanence, but they took shape nonetheless. Another house and the same locked door, but this time 2 figures. The first was familiar, tall, faceless, shadow-like. The second, smaller, hesitating near the edge of the page. Unclear, not fully formed, like a presence she wasn't ready to name. Ellison felt the air still. The temperature didn't change, but the weight of the room did. She was telling them something. Not all of it, but something. Later, he would describe it as the beginning of truth wrapped in silence. Janet Morales arrived that afternoon, a senior social worker who had spent 20 years listening to what others refused to hear. She had eyes that knew grief too well, and a voice that never rose above calm. When she entered room 204, she didn't speak. She didn't reach. She simply sat, hands in her lap, as if to say, "I'll wait as long as you need." Emily didn't look at her, but she didn't turn away either. It was enough. While Janet stayed with the child, Ellison met with Margaret Dalton in the family lounge. The older woman sat upright, a posture carved by years of carrying too much weight in silence. She clutched a half-empty coffee cup like it might shatter if set down. "I don't understand," she murmured. It was all she said for a while. Ellison nodded slowly, allowing the pause to breathe. "She was always quiet," Margaret added, "but never like this. Just sensitive, timid." "Did anything change recently?" he asked softly. In her routine, new people around Margaret hesitated. Her lips parted, then closed again. She stared down into the dark liquid as though it might answer for her. "She lives with me now," she said eventually, "since my daughter moved out of state for work. Emily didn't want to go with her. Said she wanted to stay in school. Keep her room. She's always been more comfortable at home. Home." The word didn't land gently. Ellison noted her choice of language. "Was she close with your partner?" he asked carefully. Margaret stiffened. "Rick?" "Oh, he adores her. Always did. Treated her like his own. Picks her up from school, tucks her in if I'm late from work." Ellison said nothing. Let the silence ask the questions he couldn't. Margaret blinked fast. "You don't think I'm not thinking anything yet," he lied. But he was. Because trauma doesn't emerge in children without proximity. And monsters he knew too well rarely came with snarling teeth and flashing eyes. Sometimes they came bearing bedtime stories and gentle hands. When he returned to his office, the second drawing was waiting on his desk left there by Janet with a small sticky note. Two shadows now. One hesitates. He studied it for a long time. The new figure stood farther from the house. Its edges trembled as if the artist couldn't decide whether to draw it in or erase it altogether. It had no features, but unlike the first, this figure didn't loom. It hovered. Not a predator, perhaps a witness, or worse, an enabler. He thought of Margaret again, of the way she hadn't looked him in the eye, of the coffee cup shaking just slightly in her grip. He thought of Rick and the bedtime routines, of a house where the lights might have been on, but no one had truly looked. He opened Emily's chart and made a note. Introduction of secondary figure in drawing. Lines tentative. Placement distant from subject and primary threat. Possibility of passive witness or complicit bystander. Identity unclear. Then he underlined it. Twice. That evening, Janet paid a visit to a small duplex behind Margaret's home on Ellison's suggestion. It was officially a wellness visit. Unofficially, it was reconnaissance. The man who answered the door was George Whitaker, retired soft-spoken, widowed. Lived alone. Tended roses, fed stray cats. Harmless by most accounts, he welcomed Janet with the kind of hospitality that reeked of overcorrection. "Just checking on the neighborhood," she said lightly. "Well, you picked the quietest one in town," George chuckled. But it was what he said next that sent cold through her spine. "She always had the saddest eyes, didn't she?" he said unprompted. Janet didn't answer. He smiled too quickly. "I mean Emily. Sweet girl. Quiet, always polite. Too polite. Too careful." Janet returned to the hospital an hour later and found Ellison outside room 204. "He knew her name before I gave it," she said. Mentioned her eyes, unprompted. Ellison didn't respond. He didn't have to. Inside the room, Emily was sleeping. The notebook rested beside her hand. The pencil uncapped. Still warm. It began with a movement so small it almost didn't exist. Emily's fingers shifted on the bedspread, curling slightly, brushing against the spiral notebook like it was something precious or dangerous. The pencil had rolled near her elbow during the night untouched since the second drawing. But now, as the morning sun nudged through the slats of the window, something in the room felt different. Dr. Michael Ellison noticed it the moment he stepped in. The air wasn't heavier, it wasn't lighter either, it just held its breath. Emily was sitting up. Not much, just a slight lift of her spine against the metal frame. But in a child who had spent days wrapped in layers of stillness, it was movement enough to alter the gravity in the room. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he sat in the usual chair, the one she now seemed to expect him to occupy. Between them, silence flowed like a current, Not oppressive, not yet healing. Just present. The notebook shifted again, and then, without warning, Emily picked up the pencil and placed it gently on the blanket. Her hands rested in her lap. Her gaze didn't move. Then she spoke. He told me not to tell. It was not a whisper. It was not a scream. It was a release. Dr. Ellison did not exhale. He didn't dare move. Words, once broken free, were fragile. He let them land. Emily's voice was flat, practiced, as if she had rehearsed the sentence again and again in her mind, uncertain how it would sound outside her skull. He said I'd ruin everything, she continued, that Grandma would hate me, that Mama would send me away. Her breath hitched once, but she steadied herself. The first time I thought it was a mistake, she said. That maybe it wasn't what I thought, but the second time, I knew. Dr. Ellison sat forward slowly, not reaching, not reacting, and the third time she added, I locked the door. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. Her eyes stared ahead into space as though seeing the door again, the one that never kept danger out. He leaned slightly forward. Voice steady. Was it Rick? A pause. Then a barely perceptible nod. His throat tightened, but he remained still. Beside him, the monitor blinked quietly, oblivious to the way a room could shift beneath the weight of truth. Emily's lips parted again. Not just him. Those 3 words did more damage than any scream. He knew what she meant. The second figure. The hesitant shadow in her drawing. The one not as tall, not as dark, but present. Always present. He didn't ask who. He didn't have to. She had already told him. And she had finally told the world. That night, Dr. Ellison stayed at the hospital. Not from obligation, but from a quiet compulsion to bear witness. He sat in his office with the 2 drawings laid out in front of him side by side, one filled with dark certainty, the other clouded by hesitant implication. He added a note to the file. Subject verbally confirmed Richard Shaw as primary abuser. Indicates presence of secondary actor. Identity implied as known. Emotional neutrality suggests trauma habituation. Then he paused, and wrote one more line. She has carried this alone for far too long. Police were called. Rick returned to the house that evening under the guise of collecting belongings. He was calm, his tone measured cooperative, but when asked to accompany the officers for questioning, his composure cracked. She's lying, he said too quickly. She's a kid. Kids make things up. She probably saw something on TV. But words like his no longer held weight. Not after Emily had spoken. Not after another voice came forward. Leo's younger brother, now 15, walked into the station that night and told his own version of silence. He remembered Rick, remembered the hallway, remembered the locked door. He hadn't told anyone, not because he didn't care, but because he thought no one would listen. It was always like that. Silence fed silence. Until someone finally screamed through it, back in room 204. Emily was different. Not louder, not expressive, just present. She sat up longer, drew lines that didn't tremble, picked colors although she hadn't used them yet. She acknowledged people not with smiles but with the soft weight of her eyes. Dr. Ellison noticed that she no longer clutched the blanket to her chest. Instead, it draped naturally across her lap, like armor no longer needed. He didn't speak of Rick, didn't mention George Whitaker either, but Janet did. She visited George again this time with an officer nearby. George's answers were calm, too calm. When asked about Emily, he called her sweet, polite, sad-eyed. He never once asked if she was okay. Janet returned with a note scribbled quickly in her folder, behavior consistent with passive witness. Denial layered in politeness. Oversight deliberate. Dr. Ellison didn't need proof. He had seen it in Emily's eyes. But now they would build the kind of proof the law required. Emily's third drawing came without ceremony. Janet found it beside her bed after a quiet afternoon. There was the house again. Same locked door. But this time the second figure had changed. It no longer hovered. It stood. Behind it, barely touching, was another child, faceless, small, with hands covering ears. The message was clear. Someone else had been there. Someone had seen. Someone had turned away. Dr. Ellison stared at the drawing for a long time. This was not just about abuse. This was about pattern. A pattern of looking away. A pattern of silence. A pattern of people almost asking, almost noticing, almost protecting, but never enough. He walked back to room 204 that night, the hallways quiet under soft fluorescent light. Emily was awake, sketching again, not frantically, not fearfully. Just drawing, her posture straight, her breaths steady. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She knew he had heard. And for the first time since she arrived, she looked at him, not past him, not through him, but at him. She didn't smile. But she didn't look away. It was enough. The courtroom wasn't grand. It smelled faintly of old paper disinfectant and the recycled air of too many secrets spoken aloud. The overhead lights cast an anemic glow that made everything wood-metal, even skin, look just a little washed out. Nothing here felt warm. Nothing ever did in the places where truth was called to the stand. Emily Grace Dalton sat quietly, feet barely brushing the floor. She wore a pale blue sweater, the same soft shade she had chosen in the last drawing. It clung to her frame not like armor, but like intention. On her lap rested her hands, small, still steady. Across the aisle, Richard Rickshaw sat in silence, his suit too tailored, his posture too perfect. Behind him, George Whitaker stared at the floor, eyes flicking to exits as if hoping walls might open and swallow him. But the doors were closed now, and the truth had already arrived. The prosecution was methodical. They didn't sensationalize. They didn't shout. They simply layered detail upon detail, the medical records, the statement from Leo's brother, the drawings, the silence, and finally the voice that had dared to break it. The courtroom felt suspended in breath. When Emily was called forward, Janet Morales stood beside her, one hand gently on the girl's shoulder, not guiding, not guarding, just present. Emily stepped forward. The judge's voice was soft, the oath even softer, and then she sat. She didn't look at Rick. She didn't look at George. She looked past them as if speaking to the version of herself that still lived behind a locked door. "He came into my room at night," she said. The words floated into the courtroom like the first snow, silent but undeniable. I locked the door. It didn't help. No one moved, no rustle of paper, no shifting in chairs. He told me I would ruin everything if I told, that Grandma would stop loving me, that Mama would send me away. A pause. And the other one, he never touched me. But he saw, he always saw, and he never stopped it. Dr. Ellison sat 3 rows back. He didn't blink. He didn't shift. He simply let the weight of her words settle into him bone by bone. Emily's voice didn't shake. "I didn't speak because I didn't think anyone would believe me," she said. "But I started drawing because I didn't want to forget, and I didn't want to forgive." No one asked her to elaborate. No one cut her off. The truth once named didn't need permission to live. When she stepped down, she walked past Rick without a glance, past George without hesitation. When she reached Dr. Ellison, she paused, not to lean in, not to cry, but to let her hand brush against the sleeve of his coat. It was enough. The verdict came faster than expected. Guilty on all counts. Child endangerment, sexual assault, willful neglect, complicity. Rick was led away first. Head low, mouth tight. George followed his pace slower, his eyes avoiding everything but the floor beneath his feet. Neither looked up as they passed the girl who had finally spoken. Emily, still small, still quiet, stood taller than both of them. Later, outside the courthouse, the air smelled of thaw snow melting into slush, tree branches dripping into awakening. The sky hung low, streaked with gray-blue light. Not yet spring, but no longer winter. In the back seat of Janet's car, Emily pressed her face against the glass. The drawing pad rested on her lap, closed, but not forgotten. They returned to the hospital for one final checkup. The nurses greeted her not with caution, but with something else: reverence, respect. The kind reserved for survivors, not patients. They handed her a gift, a fresh notebook. Thick pages. No lock painted on the cover. Just space. Later, in Dr. Ellison's office, she flipped it open. Not to draw, just to look, to feel. He handed her a small watercolor set. In case the world ever feels too quiet again, he said. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She slid the box into her backpack, then turned the page. And drew. One small tree. A house not perfect but intact. A sun pale yellow breaking through cloud. And this time, the door was open. She leaned back and whispered, "There's no lock." Dr. Ellison swallowed the lump in his throat. "No lock?" he echoed. Emily nodded, eyes soft. "It's okay," she said. "I'm not afraid, but not all healing is quiet. Some truths refuse to leave easily." That afternoon in the consultation room, Margaret Dalton sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across from her, Janet placed a single sheet of paper on the table. A new statement. A witness. A neighborhood child who had seen Rick enter Emily's room late at night. More than once. The child hadn't told anyone. Until now. Until guilt became too loud. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't ask who. She stared at the blinds behind Janet as if trying to keep the outside world from crashing in. "I let him in," she said finally. Her voice was flat, heavy. "I told her to call him Dad. I gave him keys." She didn't tremble. But every word felt like it clawed its way out of her. "I told her to trust him. I told her he loved her. And every time she went quiet, every time she turned away when he entered a room, I told myself she was just being moody." Janet reached out, but Margaret pulled away. She trusted me, and I handed her over. Dr. Ellison stood in the doorway unseen, but listening. He didn't judge, he didn't flinch, but his heart pulled in his chest. This was not blame, this was revelation. Margaret had not just missed the signs, she had reinforced the lie, and now she lived in the echo of that silence. Later, she asked to see Emily. Ellison hesitated, but then nodded. In room 204, Emily was sitting upright, her hair brushed behind her ears. Her hands held the new sketchbook, gently fingers tracing the edges as if learning how to hold peace. When Margaret entered, she stopped just inside the doorway. "I'm sorry," she said. Emily didn't move. "I should have known." Stillness. "I should have asked." More stillness. "I should have protected you." Emily blinked. Then slowly she turned. Not all the way. Just enough for their eyes to meet. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was recognition. A thread, thin but present, stretched between two people separated by pain but still tethered by blood and perhaps hope. Keen. Outside, the clouds broke for a moment. A shard of light spilled through the window and landed across the floor. Emily opened her notebook again. She reached for the blue. The deeper one this time. And painted sky. Not perfect. Not even. Just possible. If this story is moving you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Here, we give silence a voice, and every voice a chance to be heard. Spring arrived softly that year, almost as if it didn't want to startle anyone. The ice didn't melt with drama, it retreated slowly, respectfully. Trees didn't bloom in sudden explosions, they unfurled like secrets finally spoken. Everything whispered rather than declared. So did Emily. Her discharge from the hospital wasn't marked with balloons or fanfare. There was no celebration, no grand exit. Just quiet goodbyes, gentle nods, and one small watercolor set slipped into her backpack by Nurse Patel. "In case the world feels too loud," she had said with a knowing smile. Emily nodded but said nothing. She didn't need to. Not anymore. The ride home was silent too. Margaret drove carefully, two hands on the wheel, eyes forward. But at each red light she'd glance at the rearview mirror not to check traffic, but to check in. Emily stared out the window. Not blankly, not fearfully. Just present, alive. Not in hiding, but not yet reaching. And that too was okay. The house had been cleaned before her return. Sheets changed. Carpets shampooed. The room aired out. Margaret had moved Rick's things long before the trial but still opened the closet twice just to be sure. It wasn't about dust, it was about memory. She left the door open, not wide, just ajar, like a new habit waiting to be formed. Emily walked through the threshold and paused. The bed was still there, the desk, the little chair where she used to tie her shoes in the morning. She took it all in slowly, then walked to the window. The light looked different now, softer, like it belonged. In the weeks that followed, routine became the scaffolding of healing. Margaret prepared meals. Emily ate them. Margaret read aloud. Emily listened. Sometimes she sat beside her granddaughter on the porch, neither speaking, both simply watching the world remember how to move. One afternoon, Margaret brought home daffodils. "I thought you might like these," she said, voice trembling. Emily took the vase with careful hands. "Thank you," she said. It was the first time she had spoken to Margaret since the courthouse. That small word landed heavier than 1,000 apologies. Margaret didn't cry. She simply sat down and stayed. Emily returned to school in early April, not for full days at first, just mornings. She brought her new sketchbook. The first page was still the tree, the second a house, the third a sky. But now the sun had begun to emerge. Not a full circle, just suggestion, just glow. At recess, she sat under the oak tree near the fence. She didn't join the others, didn't speak much, but she drew. Every day. Children passed her. Some stared. Others didn't know what to say. She didn't mind. Her world was becoming her own again, not defined by the silence of others, but by the shapes she chose to give it. Dr. Ellison still checked in, sometimes by phone, sometimes in person, but always gently, never asking too much, never staying too long. He understood something most adults never did. Healing wasn't a performance. It was a process. It didn't need an audience, just space. On the first warm Sunday of May, Margaret and Emily sat on the front steps. The sun hovered at a perfect angle, not too high, not too low. Emily opened her sketchbook again. This time she reached for green. She didn't announce it. She simply began. Grass, a hill, a small bird in flight. Margaret watched without watching, her eyes turned just enough to let Emily work without pressure. After a while, Emily spoke. "They used to tell me to draw happy things," she said. Margaret nodded, unsure whether to respond. "But sometimes drawing happy feels like lying." Emily continued. "So I stopped drawing." Another pause. "I don't want to draw lies anymore." Margaret nodded again, more firmly this time. "You don't have to," she said. Emily looked at her sketchbook. "I won't," and with that she turned the page. Blank, wide, forgiving. That night, Emily drew a new picture. She didn't show it to anyone. She didn't label it, but she left it on the kitchen table the next morning, folded in half. Margaret found it while making breakfast. She hesitated before unfolding it. What stared back made her sit down. It was simple. A small house, an open door, a tree with full leaves. The sky was the richest blue yet. And at the bottom, written in faint pencil, "There's no lock." Margaret didn't cry. She didn't have to. The picture had done all the speaking. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes the loudest screams are wordless, and sometimes the most powerful healing begins with a crayon. Emily didn't stop drawing, but she no longer used it only to survive. Now she used it to imagine. She added color. She tried watercolors. She drew suns with long fingers, mountains, boats, and eventually people. People with hands. Hands that reached. Hands that waved. Hands that held. She even began teaching Margaret how to press petals into the pages, like bookmarks, she explained, of what Margaret asked. Emily smiled faintly. Moments. There were still hard days. Days when the quiet felt too big, when the wind outside made her flinch, when she didn't speak for hours. But now Margaret didn't panic. She just stayed near, made tea, sat on the floor, and hummed softly. Sometimes healing wasn't an upward climb. Sometimes it was just not falling back. On the final day of school, Emily handed her teacher a small canvas. It was wrapped in brown paper and string. Inside the same image as before, but this time with a swing hanging from the tree. It wasn't labeled. It didn't need to be. Her teacher stared at it for a long time, then hugged her without words. Emily didn't hug back, but she didn't pull away either. That was enough. At home that evening, Margaret watched Emily from the doorway. She sat at her desk, legs swinging beneath the chair, watercolor brush in hand. Not hurrying, not hiding, just being. Margaret whispered a thank you not to anyone in particular, but to whatever part of the universe had held them through the darkness. That night, as she closed her sketchbook, Emily looked up. "The sky used to scare me," she said. Margaret tilted her head, because it was too big. But now, Emily added. She paused, then whispered, "Now it just feels open." Thank you for staying with Emily's story until the end. If it moved you, if it reminded you to look closer, to listen deeper, please subscribe. Here we give silence a voice. You never know whose life your attention might save.